Reactive training systems.
What was your favorite performance yesterday?
Had to be Dana's. Watching Dana lift was, yeah, how could you say anything else, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Outside of RTS lifters, who was your second favorite?
So Tristan Naselrod comes to mind. It's always fun to watch him lift. Like, he's been doing this for a long time, and every competition he gets better, he gets better. He keeps like just steady chipping away at it, and every year he comes in better, and I think that's really cool. I think it's an example of a guy who's doing it right, who's not so caught up, so wrapped up in like winning right now that he keeps like just doing his thing, lifting his lifts, and it's working.
So, how does that relate to you and your lifting experience? Do you trying to just build your total over time, and how do you identify with that?
It's something that I wish I was better at. It's a mentality I wish I had some years ago. Like, I did the opposite of that in a lot of ways. I got caught up in like pushing harder, harder, harder. I got to win now, instead of just thinking you got to lift your lifts and it is going to be what it's going to be, and you just see where that takes you.
What kind of decisions do you think you might make or might have made differently if you had that mentality of let me build my total over time?
I would have taken a much more sensible approach in 2014 when my injury situation started. So in 2014, I was training for the Worlds, and I was in this mentality of push, push, push. Always harder. Always you have to do more. You have to do it better, and you have to win now. And I knew that I was pushing things too hard. And people around me knew I was pushing things too hard. But I mean, what are you going to do? Not try? Well, you got to lift your lifts, and those weren't my lifts to lift. So for me, I came away from that with an injury that I fought and dealt with for 2 years, and eventually got so frustrated with it that I said, you know what, I'm going to not compete until this is no longer a problem. And that ended up being like 6 years, right? Well, and I mean, there's more to it than that, and we'll get to it, but I was kind of burned out from dealing with the pain, so it just went completely away. I was like, I'm just going to do stuff that doesn't hurt. And I think that was a good decision, but it's a long road.
What did you do to not experience pain? Like you said that you did things that weren't painful. What was that?
So for me, I'm training, I'm dealing with all this pain and everything, and it was squatting and deadlifting in particular that bothered it, and really anything that put me in like this forward-leaning position. So for me, I'm just gonna do stuff that doesn't hurt, and it became centered around front squatting because I could load front squat as much as I wanted, and since I was in an upright position, it didn't hurt. I could do other stuff too, like leg pressing and things like that, but I ended up making front squat the focus. And after a few weeks, the proficiency developed, and it got to be where it was actually a lift I could train and pursue it just like it was a competition lift. So mentally, gave me something to focus on, something to work toward, and something to develop. And I do think that there were specific things that were valuable from front squatting in particular that helped to transfer back. So I'm glad that that's what I ended up choosing. But yeah, it was mostly around front squatting. That was my main workaround movement.
What about deadlift? Did you do anything different with deadlift? Any hinging changes that you made?
No, I didn't do any. I really didn't do any hinging. I couldn't find a way to do hinging that didn't also load my back, so I just didn't. And that ended up being kind of a hole in the game too. So later on, when I started reintroducing to the deadlift, some parts of the deadlift were very, very strong, but then there were other parts that basically hadn't been trained really in 5 years. So that kind of created some issues and something to be worked through. And even now, I'm trying to pay more special attention to those holes in the game, so to speak. So like if I had to do it over again, I would be more careful, more attentive to what types of things aren't getting included in whatever it is that I'm working on.
So it sounds like you went through a period where you started to incorporate the competition lifts back in. What was that process like?
Incorporating the competition lifts back in was a really kind of rocky process, to be honest. I tried to do it several times and failed to do it, not for like physical reasons, but for like scheduling reasons. So I knew that I wanted to do this gradual exposure based reintroduction period. So I would plan that out and I would say, I'm going to start with something very, very light that doesn't provoke pain, which is what you should do. So for me, I started lighter than I really had to. I started 225 pounds or 315 or something that even then it just didn't present really any sort of physical challenge whatsoever. And I thought I'm going to do 3 sets of 5 or something like that, just something really easy to start out, and I'll add 5 pounds a week. Well, I just wouldn't do it because it's so light, who cares? It doesn't feel like it's doing anything. And you're always pressed for time. I'm always pressed for time. So whenever that happens, I think, I'll get it next week. I'll move it to another session, and then it just would not get done for weeks on end. And so then you have to start the process over. So I went through several kind of restart periods like that where I would try to get back into it and then fail from like a scheduling standpoint. And I think there's some good lessons learned in that, like as a coach, or especially like for people who are just more general personal trainer types, that a lot of times it's not that, oh, I hate doing this, but it's like, I got to find a way to make it work with my life. So for me, the way to make it work with life was to include it as part of my warm-up. So instead of like doing 3 sets of 5, I said, I'm going to do 1 set of 10 and I'm going to include it as part of my warm-up for something else. So it didn't present any additional time demand or anything like that. So it was just kind of woven in. And that's what I did. So I would start at something very light. Think like, 30% of your 1RM or something like that. And I just added 5 pounds a week, 1 set of 10, until that became heavy enough to feel like training. Now it feels like training, and it's much easier to justify a little bit more priority going to that movement. But still, you have to think about it. You can't think about it like trying to get back to what you were doing before. Because we're not trying to get back. Especially in a situation like this, kind of a long-term injury type of situation, you're never going to get back to where you were before. That's not even the goal. The goal, especially in the case of a powerlifter, is to go on the platform and hopefully lift a personal best. It's not to do the training that you were doing before. So you do whatever training you can do that leads you forward. So in a situation like I was in, where I hadn't trained these lifts in a long time, we don't need to think about trying to get back to a high frequency or doing a lot of sets or doing anything in particular. We just need to do the next thing. So the process was keeping it in the warm-ups, just add 5 pounds a week. And then sooner or later you go, this is really too heavy to be a warm-up now. So you move it to its own. For me, it was a supplemental SPE slot, something that's trained, usually high reps, high volume kind of thing. But I would only do 1 set, and I'm still doing like 1 set of 10. And this was like a year ago or more than a year ago, where I posted a video of me doing like a personal best set of 10. And it was on the back of that, just 1 set a week, just incrementing, And the rest of my training week was training that was more typical of what I had been doing for a couple years at that point, lots of front squats and some belt squats and things like that. And I was doing the same thing with my deadlift too, just 1 set. It was 1 set of 10 for a long time, and then eventually it would work its way down. And then, you get far enough where you're going, this is 1 really hard set of 10. So then you drop it down to 8, and then maybe 2 sets of 5, and then so on. And by the time you're doing a couple heavy sets of 5, it's like you're really training again. This is a real training session, and it's easier to justify resources for it, and it's easier to prioritize it in your mind. And I continued on that path, right? Like even going into the competition, I still only trained the competition lifts like one time a week, and then like a couple sets. Like even at the very end when we're doing peaking stuff, it was just a couple sets. Now that's an approach that does have its difficulties, but it's the right approach considering all the training that had led up to it.
Did you have any failures along the way? Did you have any setbacks that made you reassess the approach you were taking?
I did have some setbacks along the way. Things were going great for a long time, and I'm feeling good about doing this competition, right? And then got to around 3 months out. I was doing a deadlift session, and I had a very slight tweak in my hamstring. And this goes back to the hole in the game for all those years of not doing a whole lot of hinging, not training that musculature really at all. So I pretty strongly believe that that's where that hamstring tweak came from. It's just, hey, the loads are actually getting heavy now, and you're fairly untrained in those tissues. So sometimes that's going to happen. So it's something to be dealt with for sure. And it wasn't very bad, but that led to a compensation, which led to a strain something or other in my back. It was not the same injury as before, but it was an injury. And at first I thought, this is not too bad. It may take a week for it to heal, but it kind of lingered. It lingered a little bit longer than we thought. And we had to take the weights back down and kind of re-increment them up. And when we did that, I was still having trouble, still having some pain issues. And in the process of working that out, I adopted a couple different techniques. Like I tried a slightly higher bar position when I was squatting, and that felt more comfortable. And I tried the Kokliev style deadlifting where I dropped my hips way down to initiate the pull, and that felt better in the deadlift. And quick aside on that, like even later when the weight got heavier, there is hip rise when you do that, right? And the initiating position might end up looking pretty much the same, but in my case, I felt like I was able to lock in my back position and brace better than I was in my other position. And hey, if it felt better, then it felt better. And I didn't expect it to be that strong, but through this process of kind of reintroducing through that acute injury period, we thought, let's just see where it goes. And it went pretty far. And we were actually training at the Elite FTS headquarters when we were visiting for the Arnold. I pulled weights that I hadn't touched in a couple months at that point, but I pulled them faster than I did with the old style. And I thought, maybe we're onto something here. Maybe it's really stronger. Maybe it's not really stronger or whatever, but it's at least comparable. And so we continue the experiment for a bit longer.
Do you think you're going to stay with that deadlifting style?
I'm going to stay with the kind of Kokliev drop-down style for the foreseeable. I may stay with it indefinitely, maybe not. We'll just kind of see how it goes. But for now, it's as strong or stronger, and it feels better, it feels more comfortable. So we'll continue.
Do you find any similarities to that and when people contemplate switching to an alternate style deadlift?
There's a lot of similarities between like this little approach I've taken with deadlifting and switching to sumo. We tell people to work through kind of exactly the same process, right? You initially just start it for a little while. You give it, say, I'm going to give it 4 weeks. So you give it 4 weeks, and it's not that you expect the transition to be complete in 4 weeks, but you're looking for two things. You're looking for progress and your absolute strength levels. Like, are your absolute strength levels like even in the neighborhood? And if they are, and you're progressing, then it's just continuing the experiment, right? So you're 4 weeks in, you're progressing, the absolute strength levels are close enough, so you give it another 4 weeks and see where that's at. If at some point along the way you stop progressing, or look, my sumo is 200 pounds off of my conventional, then that's going to influence your decision. And this was very similar. I'm pulling similar weights and I'm progressing, it feels better, then hey, stick with it.
Tell me about how you got signed up for the meet. Like, what made you decide after 6 years to come back and compete again?
So I was working through this reintroduction process, and we're going and going and going and getting a little bit heavier. And I knew kind of off in the distance I would like to get back on the platform again. And then my friend Brian Miner sent me a text and said, "Hey man, I signed up for this meet in December or in March." I said, "Yeah, I'm gonna sign up for it too. You know, just we're 6 months out. I can get it together in 6 months. You know, like we're on the way. We can finish this process." And so I signed up for it and started working through it at that time. And then before you know it, you're a couple weeks out, and that's when things got really fun.
What was the thing that you enjoyed the most about competing again?
It's hard to nail down what was so fun about it. It was definitely being able to be around my friends and compete with my friends. That was really cool. There's something else too, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but just being up there and the way that everything else seems less important, and you're just right here. It's just this deadlift, and you focus on it, and you throw everything you have into it, and there's not much else that matters except for this that's right in front of your face.
What has it done for your coaching to compete again?
Competing, getting back on the platform has helped me kind of get back in touch with the competitive aspect of the sport, which some people are very competitive and other people not so much, but I'm glad to be kind of back in touch with that, and it gives things a sense of urgency. And that can be a double-edged sword too, so that absolutely needs to be tempered. But I'm glad to be back in touch with it, and I'm glad to be working through that balance. And I think I've got a better mentality with competing than I had before. I mean, that's maybe another aspect of this. When I went into this competition, I had very little expectation, especially around squatting and deadlifting. I had worked up to numbers where we just kind of went, that looks like an opener, you know, but we had no idea where the top end is. Like, I hadn't lifted anything this heavy in years, you know, so we picked an opener, and, you know, the rest of it is we'll figure it out on the day, you know, and it actually made things really, really fun, and I don't think that my performance suffered because of it. So I'm still trying to figure out what exactly does that mean to me in terms of like how I personally want to plan my own stuff in the future. But it was fun to go into it and be like, yeah, I killed that. You know, we want to go up from here. Do you think we got 12 more? Yeah, I think it's there, you know, and then you try it and it is there. And so, yeah, I'm thinking that an approach like that is sometimes justified.
So what's the game plan moving forward? So you took 6 years off of competing, you came back, you competed, you had a fantastic meet. Seems like you really enjoyed it, and it seems like it's positively impacting your coaching and your ability to relate to your athletes. What's next for you?
What's next is definitely competing again. I'm feeling good, feeling healthy, and progressing. So I would love to do it again. We are moving this summer, so that's going to throw a wrench in the works. So maybe later this year, I'll find another competition to sign up for and do that, and we'll see where things go.
What lessons do you think you've learned from this experience now that you can take with you moving forward?
There's definitely several lessons learned, and it kind of depends on the frame for this, right? That if we're talking about ways to cope with long-term injury, I disengaged hard, you know, and like stopped doing stopped practicing squatting and deadlifting entirely. I would not necessarily recommend that, you know. If it is something you need to do, I kind of needed to do it, then that's one thing. But I've worked with several of my athletes who have gone through long-term injury types of scenarios, and we've not disengaged nearly as hard as I did. And I think that's for the better. I didn't have to take off as long as I did. And when you disengage that much, it makes the return process longer. And I don't know if it's more difficult. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's definitely longer. And that's not necessarily what you want. So if you can stay engaged, the more engaged you can be, the better. But absolutely take care of your physical health, And so if I end up having to do this over again, that's a lesson learned. And as far as lessons learned into the future, I don't think I would do much about my own preparation differently. I think we handled that very well. We didn't get too caught up in trying to do some sort of training that I wasn't prepared to do. There's no like model training block that I was trying to get back to. We just continued to do the next thing. So I think the preparation went really well. I would be more attentive to kind of holes in the planning a little bit, that what I was doing before wasn't quite as complete for preparing for a powerlifting competition. And I think that's one thing that we can sometimes get a little bit of a cartoon idea of what specificity is, and we just kind of think it's things that look vaguely like the competition lifts. And generally, there's some trappings with that. But one thing it can do is it can cover up some of these holes in programming that can arise if you take a less specific approach. And it's not that a less specific approach can't work or that it's wrong or anything like that. It's just that there's a few more details that you'll need to be attentive to, and so I think I've learned that as well.
What's next? Besides competing again, your athletic pursuits, like what did you learn about your lifting? What are some things that are interesting you right now and things that you want to try in your own training?
I think squatting and deadlifting is pretty straightforward. We're doing things that are working there. I do want to kind of back off of the competition lifts for a little while, like a month, not a year, and give those patterns a bit of a break. I've been training now for like 25 years, so things are a little different at training age 25 than they are even at training age 10. Like training age 10 is an achievement, and that for me was long ago. I do want to step back from the competition lifts just for a bit, and I'm still doing things that are still pretty close to competitive squatting and deadlifting, but I just want to make sure that I'm not going too hard in that direction. I don't want to irritate any sort of old injuries or anything like that. So a small off season, if you will. But my bench is something that definitely needs work, and that's an interesting thing for people to think about, I think, is if you look at my results from this competition, pretty much all of my results are about 15 kilos off of my all-time personal bests, which I'm pretty happy about, and I think it's very interesting that I managed to get that close to an all-time personal best squat and deadlift doing kind of one small session of specific work a week, and the rest of it is fairly non-specific. Again, does this look the same if you have 3 years of training experience? Probably not. But if you're an experienced lifter, maybe you don't need just more all the time. The other side of that is my bench press, which I trained my bench press in a very specific way. I trained 5 times a week. I trained a ridiculous amount of volume. There were 5 hour-and-a-half long bench sessions every week, and it was still about 15 kilos off of my personal best. So it's an interesting thought exercise to try to sort that out.
Tell me one thing that you're looking forward to most right now in this place in your training career.
I'm most looking forward to the possibility of setting new personal bests. It's the same thing that we always have, I think. And it's exciting to me now because it's close. It's tangible. And there are definitely times where, it felt far away, but you just keep going. And there's things to look forward to and things to be happy about. Training can be fun. But now it's looking like the old personal bests, which sometimes you look at and you go, that might just be the most I ever lift. Well, it might be, but now there's a real possibility that it might not be. That maybe we can do more, and that's exciting.